In 1843, 1,000 men, women, and children left Independence, Missouri, with 6 months of provisions loaded into wooden wagons. By the time they reached Oregon, most of that food was gone, rotten, eaten by insects, or abandoned on the side of the trail to lighten the load so the oxen would not collapse. What they ate instead will genuinely disturb you. Number 17 on this list was so revolting that grown men wept before putting it in their mouths. And number 3, a so-called delicacy born from pure desperation, is something modern survival experts now say was nutritional genius. These were not adventurers packing gourmet provisions. These were ordinary families, school teachers and farmers and pregnant mothers, walking 2,000 miles across a continent with no grocery stores, no refrigeration, and no guarantee they would survive the week. Historians estimate that 1 in 10 people who set out on the Oregon Trail between 1843 and 1869 never made it. And for the ones who did, food was the difference between life and death every single day. Before we start, hit that subscribe button because what you are about to learn makes every modern camping trip look like a 5-star vacation. Let us count down the 25 most shocking foods pioneers actually ate on the brutal Oregon Trail. Number 25, hardtack. Before the wagons even rolled out of Independence, families packed barrels of hardtack, a cracker so hard it could chip a tooth if you bit down wrong. Bakers mixed flour, water, and a pinch of salt, rolled the dough flat, punched holes in it with a fork, and baked it until every drop of moisture was gone. The result was a dense square about half an inch thick that tasted like salted cardboard. But it lasted for months without spoiling, which made it the most reliable food on the entire trail. Pioneers soaked it in coffee or bacon grease to make it chewable. Children gnawed at the edges. Mothers crumbled it into stews. A 50-pound barrel cost about $2 in 1848, and families packed anywhere from 200 to 400 pounds per wagon. Diary entries from the period describe hardtack with a mixture of gratitude and disgust. The same cracker for breakfast, dinner, and supper. But it kept us alive. After a few weeks on the trail, weevils would burrow into the cracks. Pioneers learned to eat in the dark so they would not see what was crawling on their food. Number 24, salt pork. Every wagon carried a barrel of salt pork, packed so tight in brine that the meat could last the entire journey if the barrel held. Pioneers sliced thick slabs from the barrel each morning, fried them in a skillet over buffalo chip fires, and ate them with hardtack or cornbread. The salt content was staggering, enough to make your lips crack and your tongue swell in the dry plains heat. But salt preserved the pork when nothing else could. A 200-pound barrel cost about $8, a serious investment for families earning maybe $300 a year. Children grew to hate the taste. Mothers tried soaking the pork in water overnight to draw out the salt, but on the trail there was rarely time or clean water to spare. By the 3rd month, the pork at the bottom of the barrel often turned rancid, the brine cloudy and foul-smelling. Families ate it anyway. Wasting food on the Oregon Trail was not an option. It was a death sentence. Number 23, dried beans. A 20-pound sack of dried navy beans cost about 50 cents in 1848, making them the cheapest source of protein a pioneer family could carry. Every evening, if the wagon train stopped early enough, mothers would boil a potful over the campfire with a chunk of salt pork for flavor. The problem was time. Beans needed hours of soaking and simmering, and most nights the wagon master pushed families to travel until dark. Diaries describe eating half-cooked beans that sat like stones in the stomach. Children suffered the worst, their bodies unused to the rough, undercooked pulses. But beans kept people alive when the meat ran out, which it always did somewhere around Fort Laramie. Pioneers who skipped the beans in their provisions list regretted it bitterly. Number 22, coffee. If there was one luxury that pioneers clung to with desperate hands, it was coffee. Green coffee beans were packed in canvas sacks, roasted each morning over the fire in a skillet, then crushed with a rifle butt or a rock and boiled in a tin pot. The taste was burnt, bitter, and gritty with grounds, but it was the only comfort most families had. Trail diaries mention coffee more than any other single food item. Men drank it at dawn before yoking the oxen. Women sipped it while nursing infants in the back of moving wagons. By 1850, coffee cost about 12 cents a pound, and families budgeted for at least 40 pounds per adult. When the coffee ran out somewhere past the Continental Divide, morale collapsed. Pioneers tried substituting parched corn, roasted acorns, even burnt bread crusts. Nothing came close. The loss of coffee broke spirits faster than broken axles. Number 21. Cornmeal Johnny Cakes. Cornmeal traveled well and cooked fast, two qualities that made it essential on the trail. Mothers mixed a cup of cornmeal with water and a pinch of salt, shaped the dough into flat cakes, and fried them in bacon grease on a hot skillet. The result was a dense, golden cake with a crispy exterior and a gritty, slightly sweet interior. Children ate them plain. Fathers wrapped them around strips of bacon. A 50-pound sack of cornmeal cost about $1 and could produce hundreds of Johnny Cakes over the course of the journey. On days when the wagon train could not stop for a proper meal, mothers would cook a batch at dawn and hand them out cold through the day. They were not good. Diary entries are clear about that. But they were fast, and they filled bellies. And on the Oregon Trail, that was all that mattered. Number 20. Buffalo meat. When the wagon trains crossed into the Great Plains, everything changed. Massive herds of bison darkened the horizon, and men who had never hunted anything larger than a rabbit suddenly found themselves chasing animals weighing 2,000 pounds on horseback. A single bull could yield 800 pounds of meat, enough to feed an entire wagon train for days. The taste was rich, darker than beef, with a wild, gamey flavor that some loved and others simply tolerated. Pioneers roasted the humps over open fires, considering the fatty hump meat the greatest delicacy of the trail. Tongues were smoked, marrow bones were cracked and sucked clean. Women sliced the lean meat thin, salted it, and draped it over the wagon to dry in the sun, making jerky for the weeks ahead. But buffalo was only available for a few hundred miles of the journey, roughly from the Platte River to Fort Laramie. After that, the herds thinned, and pioneers were back to salt pork and beans. The memory of fresh roasted buffalo haunted them for the rest of the trip. Saleratus bread. Baking soda, called saleratus on the frontier, was the pioneer housewife's secret weapon. Mixed with flour, water, and a spoonful of lard, it produced a quick bread that rose without yeast and baked in a Dutch oven buried in campfire coals. The bread came out dense but edible, a welcome change from hardtack and Johnny Cakes. Here is the strange part. Pioneers actually collected natural saleratus from alkaline deposits along the trail near present-day Wyoming. White crusts of sodium bicarbonate formed along creek beds, and families scraped it up, dissolved it in water, and used it in their baking. Some trail guides specifically noted the best collection spots, free baking soda from the ground. It tasted slightly different from store-bought, sometimes leaving a mineral tang in the bread, but it worked. Families who knew this trick ate better bread for free while others rationed their dwindling supplies. Number 18. Dried apples. A 10-pound sack of dried apple slices cost about 60 cents and occupied almost no space in a packed wagon. Mothers stewed them with sugar into a thick compote that became the closest thing to dessert most children tasted for 6 months. Mixed into cornmeal batter, they made passable fritters. Soaked overnight and baked into a crust made from lard and flour, they became dried apple pie, the single most celebrated treat on the Oregon Trail. The problem was that dried apples swelled enormously when rehydrated, and pioneers who ate too many raw slices from the bag suffered agonizing stomach cramps. Trail songs actually mocked the fruit. One popular ditty cursed the man who invented dried apples because they filled the body with pain and misery. Despite the complaints, dried apples prevented scurvy. The vitamin C content, though reduced by drying, was enough to keep gums from bleeding and teeth from loosening. Pioneers who carried dried fruit survived in better health than those who did not. First pattern break. Here is where the trail gets dark. By the time wagon trains reached the halfway point, somewhere around South Pass in present-day Wyoming, the provisions families had so carefully packed were running dangerously low. The salt pork was rancid. The flour was full of bugs. The coffee was gone, and the next resupply point was still weeks away. This is where desperation cooking began. Everything that follows on this list reflects what happened when ordinary people ran out of ordinary food and had to eat whatever the land or their own wagons could provide. When real butter spoiled in the first week of the journey, pioneer women invented a substitute by mixing flour into warm water until it formed a thick paste, then adding a pinch of salt. They spread this gray slurry on hardtack and Johnny cakes and called it butter. It contained almost no fat, no flavor beyond raw flour and salt, and the texture was described in one diary as wallpaper paste with ambition. But it made dry bread go down easier, and on the trail, that was enough to call it a luxury. Children ate it without complaint because they had never known anything different. Mothers served it with straight faces, pretending it was perfectly normal. Families who still had bacon grease mixed a spoonful in to improve the taste. Those who did not simply ate their flour paste and kept walking. Number 15, vinegar pie. With no fruit, no eggs to spare, and no milk, pioneer women made pie from the only acid they had, vinegar. The filling was nothing more than water, vinegar, sugar, flour, and a spoonful of butter if they had it. Mixed and poured into a lard crust, then baked in a Dutch oven, it emerged as a custardy, tangy slice that tasted vaguely of lemon if you used your imagination. Vinegar pie became famous on the trail because it proved that determined mothers could produce something that resembled normalcy in the middle of nowhere. Children ate it eagerly. Fathers pretended it was as good as the real thing back home. The recipe required almost nothing, and yet it delivered a moment of sweetness in a journey defined by suffering. Variations survived long after the trail closed, showing up in Appalachian and Midwestern cookbooks well into the 20th century. Number 14, parched corn. When the flour ran low, pioneers turned to a technique borrowed from Native Americans. Whole kernels of dried corn were roasted in a skillet until they darkened and popped, then carried in a pouch and eaten by the handful throughout the day. The taste was smoky, nutty, and intensely crunchy, almost like a primitive version of corn nuts. A pound of parched corn could sustain a grown man for a full day of walking, and it weighed almost nothing. Scouts and outriders carried pouches of it when they rode ahead of the wagon train, sometimes not returning for days. The problem was monotony. Eating nothing but roasted corn for days at a stretch wore down the teeth, irritated the gums, and produced a thirst that the alkaline water of the plains could not satisfy. But it was reliable, portable, and calorie-dense. Pioneers who carried parched corn as backup survived stretches that killed those who did not. Number 13, pemmican. Borrowed entirely from the indigenous peoples of the plains, pemmican was the original energy bar, and it was brutal. Lean buffalo or deer meat was dried to leather, pounded into powder, then mixed with rendered fat, and sometimes dried berries. The mixture was packed into rawhide pouches and could last for years without spoiling. The taste was dense, greasy, and intensely concentrated, like chewing a candle made of meat. Pioneers who traded with Native Americans or mountain men for pemmican discovered it was the single most efficient food on the trail. A few ounces provided enough calories for hours of hard walking. But most emigrants could not stomach it at first. The texture was foreign, the flavor overwhelming. Those who adapted swore by it. Those who refused went hungry. Number 12. Rattlesnake. When the game disappeared and the provisions dwindled, pioneers ate what crossed the trail. Rattlesnakes were abundant in the high desert country of present-day Idaho and eastern Oregon, and hungry men learned to pin the head with a forked stick, cut it off, and skin the body in minutes. Roasted over a fire, rattlesnake tasted mild and faintly sweet, closer to chicken than anything else the pioneers had eaten in months. Children refused it until hunger overruled fear. Women cooked it into stews with wild onions to disguise what it was. One diary entry from 1852 recorded the moment plainly. "We ate snake tonight. No one complained. We are past complaining." The bones were thin and numerous, making eating slow and careful. But a large rattlesnake could provide enough meat for a small family, and on the trail, you did not question providence. You ate. Number 11. Cactus. In the arid stretches of the trail, particularly through the Snake River Desert, pioneers discovered that prickly pear cactus pads could be peeled, sliced, and fried in lard. The taste was green, slightly sour, with a texture like cooked okra. The fruit, bright red and sweet when ripe, was eaten raw by children who had not tasted sugar in weeks. The mucilaginous interior of the pads also provided moisture in a landscape where clean water was scarce. Pioneers who recognized the prickly pear from descriptions in trail guides fared better through the desert crossings. Those who did not walked past survival food without knowing it. Second pattern break. What you need to understand is that the Oregon Trail was not one road. It was a corridor of death that stretched 2,000 miles across prairies, deserts, and mountains. By the time families reached the Blue Mountains of eastern Oregon, many had been walking for 5 months straight. Their shoes were worn through, their children were sick, and their food was whatever they could scavenge, trade, or kill. The entries that follow are not recipes, they are acts of survival. Number 10. Boiled rawhide. When the food was truly gone, pioneers boiled strips of rawhide from their own wagons and equipment. Ox yokes, spare harnesses, even the leather covers of trunks went into the pot. Hours of boiling turned stiff leather into a gelatinous, rubbery substance that could be chewed and swallowed. It provided almost no nutrition beyond trace collagen, but it gave the stomach something to work on and quieted the pain of hunger. Diary entries describe the taste as old boots cooked in dishwater. Children gagged. Adults chewed with blank expressions. The Donner Party is the most famous example, but dozens of lesser-known wagon trains resorted to boiled rawhide during river crossings, mountain passes, or stretches where game simply did not exist. Number 9. Ox meat. Oxen were not food. They were transportation. Killing an ox meant abandoning the wagon and everything in it. But when an ox went lame, broke a leg in a prairie dog hole, or simply collapsed from exhaustion, pioneers butchered it on the spot. The meat was tough, stringy, and tasted of the months of grass and alkaline water the animal had consumed. But it was fresh meat, and on the trail that meant everything. Families roasted what they could eat immediately and dried the rest into jerky. Some wagon trains recorded losing half their oxen to injury, disease, or exhaustion. So ox meat became an increasingly common, if heartbreaking, food source. Pioneers named their oxen. They talked to them during the long walking days. Then they ate them when they had no choice. Number 8. Prairie dog. Small, plentiful, and easy to catch compared to antelope or deer, prairie dogs were the desperation protein of the Great Plains. Boys dug them out of their burrows or poured water down the holes to flush them to the surface. Skinned and roasted, a prairie dog yielded only a few ounces of greasy meat with a wild, musky flavor that most pioneers found deeply unpleasant. But hungry children ate them without argument. Mothers boiled them into thin soups with wild grass and whatever dried beans remained. One immigrant journal from 1847 noted that we have become a family of prairie dog hunters, and we are not ashamed. The animals were so abundant that some wagon trains survived days at a time on nothing else. Number 7. Wild greens and roots. Pioneer women foraged along the trail with a knowledge that often meant the difference between sickness and survival. Lamb's ear, dandelion greens, wild onions, and sago lily bulbs were gathered in aprons and boiled into soups or eaten raw alongside the evening meal. The greens provided vitamins that salt pork and hardtack could never deliver. Sago lily bulbs dug from the high desert soil tasted faintly sweet and starchy when roasted. Native Americans had eaten them for centuries, and pioneers who learned from them or from trail guides survived in better condition. Women who foraged kept their families healthier. The knowledge was shared between wagons, passed from one mother to another as quietly and urgently as medicine. Number 6. Bone marrow soup. When nothing remained but stripped carcasses and cracked skeletons left by previous wagon trains or their own butchered animals, pioneers split the bones and boiled them for hours. The marrow rendered into the water, producing a thin, greasy broth that was rich in fat and calories. Modern nutritionists now recognize bone broth as one of the most nutrient-dense foods available, packed with collagen, minerals, and amino acids. Pioneers did not know the science. They only knew that the broth gave them strength when everything else had failed. Mothers fed it to sick children by the spoonful. Men drank it before dawn. It tasted of nothing and everything, a liquid reminder that survival demanded creativity. Number 5. Insects. Grasshoppers swarmed the prairie in biblical clouds during certain years, and starving pioneers ate them. Roasted over the fire until crispy, they tasted nutty and crunchy, like burned popcorn. Some families ground them into powder and mixed the protein-rich flour into Johnny cake batter. Others ate them whole by the handful, closing their eyes and chewing fast. Native American tribes had harvested grasshoppers as a protein source for centuries, drying and storing them for winter. Pioneers who overcame their revulsion discovered a food source that was literally falling from the sky. One 1848 account described children catching grasshoppers like a game, laughing as they filled buckets. Their mother fried them in the last of the bacon grease. Nobody laughed, but nobody went hungry. Number 4. Alkali water bread. In the alkaline desert stretches of present-day Nevada and eastern Oregon, the only water available was so saturated with minerals that it burned the throat and sickened livestock. Pioneers discovered that mixing this bitter alkaline water with flour produced a bread that actually rose without any leavening agent. The natural sodium carbonate in the water reacted with the dough the same way baking soda would. The bread tasted metallic and faintly bitter, but it rose and it filled the stomach when nothing else would. Families who figured this out gained a crucial advantage through the worst stretches of the trail. They turned poison water into something that resembled food. When food was completely exhausted and the next settlement was still days away, pioneers ate their own candles. Tallow candles were made from rendered beef or mutton fat, and while the taste was waxy and rancid, the fat content was enormous. A single candle could provide hundreds of calories. Melted into hot water with a pinch of salt, tallow became a crude broth. Chewed raw, it provided the energy to keep walking when the body had nothing left. Modern survival experts call this one of the smartest desperation moves on the trail. Fat is the most calorie-dense macronutrient, and pioneers who ate their candles survived stretches that killed others who refused. They chose darkness to stay alive, and it worked. Number 2. Bark bread. In the forested mountain passes of the Cascades and Blue Mountains, when all provisions were gone and game was scarce, pioneers stripped the inner bark from pine trees, dried it, and pounded it into a coarse flour. Mixed with water and baked on hot stones, it produced a dense, resinous bread that tasted like turpentine and sawdust. Native Americans had used this technique for generations during lean winters, and starving pioneers copied them without hesitation. The cambium layer beneath the outer bark contained starches, sugars, and enough fiber to quiet a screaming stomach. It was not food in any recognizable sense, but it kept families moving through the final miles when Oregon City shimmered like a mirage just beyond the next ridge. Number 1. Boiled boot leather. At the absolute bottom of the Oregon Trail food chain sat the boots on your own feet. When every provision was exhausted, when the oxen were dead, the candles eaten, and the rawhide stripped from the wagons, pioneers cut the leather from their own shoes and boiled it for hours until it softened into a dark, gelatinous mass that could be chewed and swallowed. The taste was indescribable, a combination of sweat, tanning chemicals, dirt, and despair. But the collagen in the leather provided just enough sustenance to keep a body moving, giving a desperate form of survival. Families walked the final miles into the Willamette Valley barefoot, their boots in their stomachs. Diary entries from the 1840s and 1850s record the act with quiet devastation. "We have eaten everything. Today we ate our shoes. The children do not cry anymore." This was not a rare occurrence. Multiple accounts from different years confirm that dozens of families resorted to boiled footwear in the final desperate push over the mountains. It is the single most haunting image of the Oregon Trail. People so determined to reach a new life that they consumed the very thing carrying them there. Every single item on this list was eaten by real people, mothers and fathers and children who left everything behind for the promise of free land and a fresh start. They did not have trail mix or energy bars or freeze-dried meals. They had flour, salt, and whatever the land gave them. And when the land gave them nothing, they ate their wagons, their candles, and their shoes. The next time you complain about the grocery store being out of your favorite brand, remember that 170 years ago, families crossed a continent on hardtack and hope. Share which entry shocked you most in the comments. And if you made it this far, you owe it to yourself to subscribe, because the stories we tell next might be even harder to believe.